War is a symphony of noise, the scream of a Stuka dive bomber, the chatter of an MG-42 machine gun, the earth-shattering roar of an artillery barrage. These are the sounds of nations in conflict. But sometimes, the sound that signals the true, irrevocable end of a war is a whisper, the fizz of a freshly opened Coca-Cola, the clean snap of a chocolate bar, the crinkle of a candy wrapper. For the soldiers of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, these were the quiet sounds that broke their world. Between 1943 and 1945, nearly 400,000 German soldiers, men forged in the fires of Nazi ideology, convinced of their own invincibility, began a journey they never imagined. Captured on the burning sands of North Africa and in the bloody hedgerows of France, they were shipped to the one place their leaders had promised them was a nation on the verge of total collapse: the United States of America. They had been taught they were a master race. Their Yamato Damashi, their unalterable spirit, was supreme. They were about to learn that spirit cannot run an engine, willpower cannot harvest a field, and an entire ideology can be dismantled by a single, undeniable fact: abundance. This is the untold story of the war America fought without firing a shot. Not a military campaign, but a psychological one, waged with calories, kilowatts, and a shocking display of ordinary, everyday plenty. It is the story of how America defeated the mind of the Third Reich, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, brightly lit prison camps nestled deep in its own heartland. To understand the depth of the shock, you must first understand the meticulous construction of the lie. The world of the average German soldier, a man we'll call Klaus, a composite of thousands of real POWs, was built on a foundation of glorious, necessary sacrifice. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, a master architect of illusion, had painted a masterpiece of deception. America, he preached from every radio and newsreel, was a degenerate nation, a mongrel society, weakened by jazz music and Hollywood fantasies. It was a chaotic cesspool of races, crippled by the Great Depression, torn apart by gangsters, and paralyzed by union strikes. Its people were soft, lazy, and materialistic. Its democracy was a failed experiment. German newsreels showed carefully selected images of breadlines in New York, conveniently omitting that Germany had been rationing food since 1939, before the war even began. Back home, Klaus's own family survived on the Reichsbrot, a dense bread bulked up with rye flour, beet pulp, and even sawdust. Their weekly ration was a few ounces of tough meat, a smear of margarine, and watery soup. Their coffee was ersatz, a bitter brew made from roasted acorns and chicory root. The nights in German cities were tombs of darkness. Every window was covered with a thick blackout curtain. To show even a sliver of light was to risk a visit from the Gestapo or a bomb from the Royal Air Force. The constant, gut-wrenching hum of air raid sirens was a nightly lullaby, but this was all framed as strength. Sacrifice was a virtue. Scarcity was a sign of a nation's iron discipline. The Reich was teaching its people to be proud of their hunger, to see their suffering as proof of their superiority. Armed with this fanatic certainty, Klaus and his comrades fought. They were the true inheritors of the earth, destined to rule a 1,000-year Reich, until they were captured, and the doors to the real world creaked open. The journey across the Atlantic was a descent into the unknown. Packed by the thousands into the hulls of Liberty ships, vessels that Admiral Donitz's U-boats were supposed to have swept from the seas, the prisoners braced for the worst. Rumors swirled in the darkness. They would be used as slave labor in the mines. They would be handed over to the vengeful Soviets. They would be executed upon arrival. They had been told for years that the Americans were barbarians, no different from the commissars of Bolshevism. Then the ship's massive doors groaned open. It wasn't the glare of an executioner's spotlight that met their eyes. It was the full unobscured light of day reflecting off the waters of New York Harbor. And there, rising from the mist like an apparition, was the Statue of Liberty. For men raised on images of a burning, collapsing America, the sight was profoundly, spiritually disorienting. But the true shock, the first direct assault on Goebbels' entire world, came as night fell. As their transport ship moved to a dock in New Jersey, the prisoners were allowed on deck. They stared across the Hudson River. The island of Manhattan wasn't dark. It wasn't a city cowering under siege. It was a blazing, unapologetic constellation of light. Skyscrapers glowed from within. Colossal advertising signs pulsed with vibrant color, and bridges draped across the river like necklaces of diamonds. In Berlin, a single lit candle in a window was a crime. Here, an entire metropolis burned with a defiant, casual, impossible brilliance. One prisoner, a university student from Munich, wrote in a secret diary, "Goebbels told us the American cities were dark with fear. Tonight, I saw more light in one city than exists in all of Germany. It was the light of a nation that is not afraid. At that moment, I knew a great lie had been told. This single view did more to undermine Nazi propaganda than 1,000 Allied pamphlets. The journey inland was a second wave of attack. Herded onto passenger trains, they expected the same filthy cattle cars the Reich used to transport its own prisoners. Instead, they found clean carriages with actual glass windows and padded seats, and through those windows, the true, terrifying scale of the enemy revealed itself, kilometer by kilometer. The train tracks were not a single line, but a sprawling river of steel, shared by an endless parade of locomotives. By 1944, America operated over 43,000 locomotives. The entire German Reich, stretched thin across a conquered continent, had fewer than half that, and most of those were in disrepair. The freight cars they passed were a rolling inventory of America's power. They saw not just tanks and guns, but entire trains loaded with mountains of coal, forests of lumber, and endless flatbeds carrying brand-new automobiles, tractors, refrigerators, and crates of sun-kissed oranges from a place called California. They were witnessing a nation's surplus capacity on full, glorious display. Through the windows, they saw a country not at war, but merely busy. Towns buzzed with life. Civilians drove their cars, not for essential state business, but for errands, for leisure. Movie theaters advertised the latest Hollywood films. Children played baseball in open fields. There were no bomb craters, no uniformed soldiers on every corner, no pervasive sense of dread. The war, it seemed, was an enormous project for America, but it was not consuming it. It was simply another task on the nation's assembly line. The hollow giant was anything but. The final destination was a camp in the vast, flat expanse of the Midwest, one of over 500 such camps that would eventually house the German prisoners. The barbed wire and guard towers confirmed their status, but once inside the perimeter, the psychological indoctrination began its most intense phase. The first battle was waged 3 times a day in the mess hall. Klaus, haunted by memories of half-rotten potatoes in the Russian winter and the gnawing hunger of the front lines, stared at the tray before him. Thick slices of roast beef, potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, a slice of apple pie, and a tall, cold glass of milk. It wasn't a meal. It was a weapon, an act of weaponized hospitality. U.S. Army quartermaster records show a deliberate strategy. Each German prisoner was to receive a daily ration of over 3,200 calories. This wasn't just humane. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The American government knew that this ration was more than double what the prisoners' own families were surviving on back in Germany. With every single bite of food, every sip of fresh milk, the prisoners were forced to confront a terrible, corrosive truth. The enemy was feeding its captives better than the Reich was feeding its own citizens. The assault on their reality continued with luxuries that were simply unthinkable back home. Packs of Lucky Strike or Camel cigarettes were distributed daily. Coca-Cola, a mythical beverage they'd only heard about, appeared on special occasions. Inside the camp canteen, prisoners who earned scrip from their labor could buy candy bars, magazines, even ice cream. Imagine a German soldier who had just spent months fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad, now leafing through a full-color copy of Life magazine, seeing advertisements for new cars, washing machines, and smiling families on vacation. It was a vision from another universe. But perhaps the most profound shock came not in the mess hall, but in the infirmary. Nazi ideology prized the collective over the individual. A wounded soldier was a broken part, to be fixed quickly or discarded. American medicine presented a jarringly different philosophy. A prisoner with a shattered leg wasn't left to die or face a crude amputation. He was given anesthesia and surgery by a trained doctor. A soldier with a raging infection wasn't ostracized. He was treated with penicillin, a miracle drug that seemed to work with godlike power. They received dental care, glasses, and treatment for chronic conditions. This demonstration that an individual life, even the life of an enemy, was considered valuable enough to expend precious resources on, was perhaps the most radical idea of all. It stood in stark opposition to the Nazis' disposable man theory of warfare and their entire eugenics-based worldview. An officer from the Afrika Korps wrote in a letter home, which was read by censors. "They are trying to kill us with kindness, but what it is really killing is our belief. How can a nation on the brink of collapse afford such waste on its enemies?" The answer lay in the numbers. American factories were producing 290 billion cigarettes a year. Penicillin was being mass-produced by the ton. The war effort hadn't stopped American consumer life. It had simply added another massive production line alongside it. Soon the prisoners were put to work, assigned to labor-starved farms and factories in the surrounding countryside. And it was here outside the wire that they witnessed the true source of America's power. Some were sent to factories like Ford's Willow Run, a sprawling industrial city under a single roof. There, they saw B-24 Liberator bombers rolling off the assembly line. The pace was beyond belief, one bomber every 63 minutes, and the workforce itself was a shock. Thousands of positions were filled by women, the Rosie the Riveters of American legend, working with a confidence and skill that shattered the Nazi ideal of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. This industrial spectacle was a lesson taught in thunderous noise and overwhelming scale. But for men raised on the Nazi ideology of Blut und Boden, blood and soil, which glorified the German peasant as the soul of the nation, what they saw in the American heartland was the final, crushing blow. The farms were not quaint plots of land. They were empires of agriculture. A single Iowa farm was often larger than the entire village a prisoner came from. And these fields weren't worked by stooped men with horses. They were commanded by machines, roaring John Deere and Farmall tractors that did the work of 50 men, harvesting more corn in a single afternoon than a German village could in a week. While Germany's agricultural system still relied heavily on horse-drawn plows, America had nearly 8 million tractors in the field. This wasn't just farming. It was industrial food production on a scale that defied the European imagination. But the most potent weapon wasn't a machine. It was a man, a farmer named John Whitaker, who saw the prisoners not as monsters from a propaganda film, but as weary young men far from home. In an act that violated all wartime logic, he invited a small group of them to his home for Sunday supper. Under the watchful eyes of their guards, Klaus and the other prisoners stepped into a scene from a life they no longer thought possible. A dinner table groaning with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh-baked bread, and pies cooling on the windowsill. The farmer's children, who had been taught these men were the enemy, stared with wide-eyed wonder before timidly offering them a glass of milk. There was no talk of politics, no debate of ideology. There was only the simple, deeply human ritual of sharing a meal. For Klaus, looking at the farmer's son, a boy the same age as his younger brother in Hamburg, the entire structure of his hatred collapsed. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster from a propaganda poster. He had a family. He had a home, and he had chosen to share his abundance, not hoard it. A sergeant from Prussia, a man who had won the Iron Cross at Stalingrad, wept silently over his slice of apple pie. He later wrote, "We were prepared to die for Germany. We were not prepared for a slice of pie from an American farmer. In that moment I knew our cause was lost, not because their armies were stronger, but because their humanity was." Back in the camps, an ideological civil war began to brew. The die-hard Nazis preached defiance, insisting it was all an elaborate trick. "They fatten us for the slaughter," they'd hiss. But for tens of thousands, the evidence was too overwhelming to deny. The seeds of doubt, planted by a glowing city and watered by fresh milk, had taken root. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the re-education began in earnest. Prisoners were shown films of the liberated concentration camps. For many, this was the first horrifying look at the ultimate endpoint of the ideology they had served. The images of skeletal survivors at Auschwitz and Buchenwald, when viewed after months of experiencing American abundance and kindness, created a cognitive dissonance so profound it shattered their world for a second and final time. Then came the journey home. They returned to a nation in ruins, a landscape of rubble and ghosts. They had left a land of impossible plenty and come home to a continent of absolute scarcity. The contrast was the ultimate confirmation. Their 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and had ended like this, while the nation that they were told was weak and degenerate was not only untouched, but stronger than ever. When these 400,000 men returned, They carried a truth more powerful than any Allied directive. At first, their stories were met with disbelief. Tales of endless food, bright cities, and kind farmers sounded like fever dreams to a starving populace. But slowly the stories spread, becoming a kind of underground folklore. They were the first-hand witnesses who could confirm that the Nazi myth was a lie, and that the American giant was real. They had seen the engine room of the arsenal of democracy, and it had changed them forever. They had learned the ultimate lesson of the war, that a nation's true strength isn't measured by the fanaticism of its soldiers or the fury of its rhetoric, but by its ability to produce, to sustain, and most incredibly, to show mercy. The Third Reich was a hollow ideology built on a myth of superiority. That myth was not just defeated on the beaches of Normandy. It was quietly and completely dismantled. One meal, one cigarette, and one act of kindness at a time, in the heart of the very nation it had so fatally underestimated. The war was won by the soldier, but the peace was secured by the farmer and the factory worker, who proved that the greatest weapon of all is a society of unimaginable, undeniable plenty.